Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. My name is James Walker. I'm co-founder. I am a Christian and the co-founder along with Bill Cluck of the book club. We started about 6 years ago. We are a monthly gathering of believers and atheists respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. Typically what we'll do is we'll look at a Christian book one month, the atheist book the next month, and we want to promote respectful dialogue, conversations, and we want to welcome you to the club. I did want to announce that we did have some bad news. One of our longtime members, Mike Cahill, passed away. And most of you heard this on our Friends of the Atheist Christian Book Club Facebook page, but if you didn't, he did pass away June 21st. He had been to the book club, I think, probably for 4 years now, and is friends with one of our longtime members, Ken Daniels. I know, Ken, I didn't ask you this ahead of time. Could you tell us a little bit about Mike and what happened and how you know him, and just help us remember him?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the opportunity. So I first got to know him in '94, spring of '94. I was a student of his actually at the SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics training school, which I attended as a part of preparing myself to become a Bible translator in Africa. He was a linguistics professor. He taught grammar, not grammar for any particular language, but how to learn the grammar of any language in the world that's perhaps unwritten, unstudied. And so he was a taskmaster. He was very, he kept us honest and he taught well. It was a class for me. I usually do pretty well in school, but it was challenging. So he taught me well. Where I eventually changed my views on the nature of God and Christianity and so forth, and eventually left the faith. Came back from Africa. He knew about me, and he kind of struck up a friendship and reached out to me. And periodically, ever since then, after we came back, we've gone out to Dairy Queen and just had heart-to-heart talks. And he's, he was concerned for me, obviously, as a Christian, and he was concerned, but he was never condescending. He was never belligerent. Very brilliant guy. He got a doctorate in linguistics a number of years ago. He was a translator himself in Africa, in Ghana. He had 3 kids. They served 11 years out there. They didn't finish the translation themselves, but they trained some African translators to carry out the work that they would have done themselves. I think there were some family matters that led them back. One of them being their daughter was born with microcephaly and was in constant care from both him and his wife all these years, and so they've been her primary caregiver. So it's really going to be difficult, I think, for his wife Jinya, who's left behind. He passed away now at age 70. I assume she's around the same age. And so that's going to be an ongoing challenge for her and the family to, take care of their daughter. A sweet, sweet girl.
And this was sudden too, wasn't it?
Yeah, I had been meeting with him, in fact, he invited me to meet with him again in May. And I wasn't able to meet that one weekend. And I said, well, maybe the next week. And the last message I got from him was, we'll see. So I didn't know at the time that he had been, I guess he had a little bit of pneumonia. And so he got some chest x-rays and they showed spots in his lungs and various other organs. And within a matter of 6 weeks, he was gone. So I understand he didn't have a lot of pain. He was in the hospital. They gave him chemo, even though he had an infection, but he wanted to fight it because that was the only option. And so he went with the chemo, but the next day he passed away. I don't know if it was a direct result of the chemo, if that accelerated it, but at least he didn't suffer long. So we're glad about that. But I always felt his concern and care, and um, very intelligent man, very dedicated man. I went to his funeral or his memorial service last week. It was packed to the gills. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of people there. There would overflow into another building. Just it made me reflect on my own life, and it's like the legacy that somebody like that has. He was a Boy Scout master. Even after his son grew up and left, he remained part of the troop. There were a bunch of troop members there in uniform to salute him. Very influential man. So he'll be missed.
Thanks for sharing that. And again, I think it was your influence that got him into the club. I know he was there when you shared your own book with us. I remember, I think he was there before that as well, wasn't he? But anyway, that's my first memory
Yeah,
of
he
it.
came as a result of my letting him know about it. So he thought it was interesting, and he's always up for a good discussion. So that brought him in.
We will certainly miss him, and appreciate you sharing that with us. Just a little housekeeping real quickly. We've got the video from last month's club with Eric Hernandez, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism. It's up for those who want to watch last month's club. It's at atheistchristianbookclub.com. I also want to announce, before we get into this month, rather, I wanted to go ahead and announce what we're going to have next month. We're going to have another one of our book club members. I think this is the fifth. This will be the fifth or maybe the sixth book club member that's actually sharing their book with us. So Phil Bear is going to be talking with us on August 1st at 7 o'clock Central Time via Zoom out of Colorado. And he's going to be talking about his new book, his latest book, Machines Don't Laugh. And Phil, you're with us right now. Could you just give us the elevator pitch on the book and why we need to be reading that and talk with you about it next on August 1st?
Sure. Yeah, the book was inspired by some acquaintances of mine, actually, not just acquaintances, actually, people who were close to me, some of them, who had fallen away from Christianity. And I'm convinced that every time someone falls away from Christianity, it's because of a logical fallacy. And so the subtitle of the book is Addressing the Fallacies of Atheism. Again, because they've been addressed many times before, but I wanted something that would be more consumable to the average Christian instead of someone who is an extremely learned scholar. And so if one person could avoid falling away from Christianity as a result of this book, then it was time well spent.
Well, we look forward to reading that, and I'm sure the atheist members of the club look forward to asking you some tough questions about it. I hope we get some tough questions. I believe we will. And we will have all the links to where you can get the book through Amazon, etc., at atheistbookclub.com. Go there, and we will have the links to that. I will work with Phil on this. We usually also try to have a YouTube alternative. If you don't have time to read the book or don't have access to it, we'll try to find a video or make a video that will give you a quick access to some of the content. And we'll talk also, Phil, maybe we need to have 2 or 3 focus chapters that we can put most of the attention on. So I'm looking forward to that, and that will be August 1st. And special guest, I'm going to call her a member of the club too, because she's been here at least once or twice. And this is Kelly Pearsall, and she is also known as Godless Granny. She's our guest speaker today, and we're going to be able to ask her some questions. She is a retired attorney and a former Christian herself, a now atheist. And she is the proprietor of the YouTube channel Godless Granny. One of our members and one of our staff members at our ministry, Watchman Fellowship, I did an interview, Daniel Ray, and I hope a lot of you got to watch the interview. That will give us some questions. And I know some of you have watched several of the programs available on Godless Granny YouTube channel, and we will talk with her. And so, Kelly, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, great, great. So, I am the co-founder. I'm president of a ministry called Watchman Fellowship, which is a Christian apologetics ministry focusing primarily on interfaith evangelism. And we've been doing this for about 6 years. But my other partner on this is the kind of the atheist component of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, and that's Bill Cluck. Bill, welcome back yourself. And did you want to start off with a question?
Oh, absolutely. And thank you, Double G, for all you've done for skepticism and informing Christians about their delusion. And I'm just so thankful for what you do.
You are most welcome.
So I'd like to have a little Bible quiz to start off. Where did this come from? A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. Do not let a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. What book?
It's either First Timothy or it's Ephesians. I know there's a verse in First Timothy about that, but I don't know whether that one in particular.
And it's so sad that you have so much to offer. You're so knowledgeable, and that the church held you back. Isn't that sad?
Yeah. There's absolutely no question about that. You know, I went to a number of churches where I wasn't even allowed to teach Sunday school unless all the members of the Sunday school class were under 12, or I could teach junior high or high school if I had a male partner that was with me teaching as well.
It's just ridiculous. So anyway, I think you're going to be interviewing Ken Daniels. Is that correct?
That is correct. Saturday, Ken Daniels is going to be my guest. It's going to be a wonderful conversation.
Oh my gosh. I can hardly wait. Here's his book, Why I Believe. And it is one of the most comprehensive books. I read it every time I'm just sitting in the car. And whatever subject it is, prophecy, morality, older if younger, he's got so much to offer. So here's the second step of the quiz. This is one of my favorite Old Testament verses. And the Lord was with Judah, and he drove out the inhabitants of the mountains, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had
iron chariots.
What book is that from?
I'm not sure. It could be Exodus. It could be Deuteronomy. I'm not sure.
It's Judges.
It's Judges. Okay.
All right. Last question. On the seventh day, the boat came to rest on a mountain, and he sent forth 3 birds, a dove, a swallow, and a raven. What book's that from?
That's obviously Genesis. That's obviously the flood.
Obviously not. This is from the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Oh, okay.
Would you like to know what Genesis says?
That's where they took the story.
Okay, Bill, that's you to the trick questions now. That's a trick question.
Yeah, that's not right, Bill. You got to give her credit for that one, man.
Well, here's the thing. The reason I asked that was to lead up to the fact that one of the big factors in your deconversion was when you heard Aaron Ross say how crazy Noah's flood is. A global flood. Let me tell you, I took a class, Legends in Genesis, at Bart Ehrman's thing in North Carolina. He didn't teach the class, but I asked the professor, I said, well, some of us think that a global flood is real. I mean, what's the chances that a global flood is historical? And he looked at me, and I can still remember, he goes, Bill, you always ask these unanswerable questions. He goes, that would be like 0%. And it's like, the rest of the world sees the insanity of this. I mean, Noah's flood and you looked at Gossick about the heat problem, just destroys it right there. It's not even internally consistent. It has like 7 days in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Genesis P and J authors have 40 and 150. It's a blended narrative. So tell me about, was that the biggest factor, or were there things leading up to your deconversion?
There was something leading up to it that was probably more important that occurred about 2 weeks before that. And that was when I was simply reflecting on the life of the Apostle Paul. And I reasoned my way into the divine hiddenness problem. And I did not know that that is what I had done until 2 years later when I described the process and a philosopher was watching it. And he said, she's describing the divine hiddenness problem. She just doesn't have the vocabulary. But what I had done was I was thinking about now, I had been into Calvinism at that point, and I was under the impression that Calvinism was a more biblical way of looking at the scriptures. But I started thinking about, okay, does God want everyone to be a believer? And I know the Calvinist answer is no. The Calvinist answer is God only calls the elect, and everyone else is, I now call them the unelect. But I started thinking for the first time about what that meant. That meant God made these people with the intent that they go to hell. He never wanted them. He never loved them. He didn't want to save these people. I said, that just didn't sit with me right with the nature of who God is supposed to be. And so then I started thinking, okay, if Calvinism is wrong and the Arminian view is correct, we still have a problem, because if God wants everyone to come to know him, is God able to communicate that to humans? Well, obviously, yes, if God is perfect and, he's all powerful. Well, then why doesn't he? And the answer you always get from the Christians is free will, free will, free will. But that doesn't answer the question, because God personally, so allegedly, appeared to the Apostle Paul and revealed himself. Why? Well, obviously because God wanted Paul. God had plans for Paul. Okay. Well, does he not have plans for other people? Why not do whatever it takes? And I'm not saying it has to be a personal appearance, but if God really is omniscient, he would know what it would take for each person to know him. So if he truly desires for each person to know him, there should be nothing stopping him from supplying each person with that information.
Well said. And one of your best interviews, all-time favorite, is with the Calvinator. What is the name of that interview? An Atheist and Christian?
Joe Ensley.
Joe Ensley, okay. And again, from my Bible here, on page 92. Oh, and you said, Joe, how about if your children were not elect? Would you be upset? And he goes, oh, let them burn. I don't care. But it gets worse. On page 92 of Kent's book, it says, the sight of hell torments will exalt the happiness of the saints forever. It will really make their happiness greater, as it will make them more sensible of their own happiness. Again, can the believing husband of heaven be happy with his unbelieving wife in hell? Can the believing father in heaven be happy with his unbelieving children in hell? Can the loving wife in heaven be happy with her unbelieving husband in hell? I tell you, yea, such will be their sense of justice that it will increase rather than diminish their bliss. That's from the great Jonathan Edwards. What do you think of that?
I think it sounds very similar to Bart Ehrman's most recent book on Revelation. He talks about the contrast between the teachings of Jesus, that the Christian is supposed to be humble and is supposed to be a servant, and he's constantly reminding his disciples that the reward is the service itself. And yet Revelation paints a completely opposite view of that in Revelation, the Christians are the conquerors. They're slaughtering their enemies. They're living in opulent wealth. And he contrasts that and says, that doesn't sound like the Jesus of the Gospels at all.
By the way, if you've ever dealt with Calvinists, they know everything. they're actually very educated, and when you go, well, I've been to several Sunday schools, and the leaders, the highest positions are Calvinists, and a lot of them want to go into these churches and convert everybody to Calvinists, but you can never argue with them because, well, how about the killing of God's sovereign, we can't question. Well, how about, it's always they defer to God's sovereignty like that. And by the way, Phil, you've just written a book on this, and I saw an interview, a really good interview you had about this with Leighton Flowers. Was that it?
Yeah, I published a book last year called Calvin's Desperation. And I show how Calvinism is not a proper understanding of the biblical soteriology and of God's sovereignty. So I resonate deeply with what you're saying, Bill. and I actually, Leighton and I have had lots of discussions about this, and I have to humbly, carefully agree that you can't tell Calvinists anything.
Let me ask you something, Bill. And if you were to become a Christian again, God forbid, but if you were to become a Christian again, what kind of Christian would you be?
Well, obviously a Calvinist is the highest form of Christianity. I mean, by the way, Double G.
No, the Catholics are the one true faith.
I know that, but it's obvious the Calvinists
I'm
are
serious,
so
Bill.
intellectual. They're so rich, and they're not emotional basket cases like the Arminians. They're pure intellect, pure rigor. So you had reached the highest form of Christianity, Calvinism. Where did you go wrong?
Well, Bill, you should read my book, and you will discover that the Calvinists do not apply pure rigor, and there is Calvinism in so many ways is actually self-defeating. So, but I don't want to get off on a bunny trail about that, but I appreciate your comments about that.
So Double G, where did you go wrong? I mean, you had reached the highest level of Christianity, right?
What do you mean by where did I go wrong?
Well, you were a Calvinist. You had all the answers.
Oh, okay. I guess I broke my Calvinism when I realized it didn't have all the answers.
Okay.
You know, when I couldn't answer that question, I pivoted to my own personal theology, which was that because God is just and fair, that after death, God was going to reveal himself to any unbeliever and lay everything out on the line and give them a choice of, do you want to live with me or not? And that we would have a fully informed decision after death. And I know that's not biblical, but it's not anti-biblical either. The Bible doesn't say it didn't happen. So I went with that for 2 weeks.
So at the club, we had a cosmologist who really had some insightful things on fine tuning. He wrote a book, A Fortunate Universe. I forgot his name. But anyway, he said that if these laws and parameters are not exactly right, like, for example, the cosmological constant has to be fine-tuned to 10 to the 120th, the gravitational 10 to the 40th, and even something as small as the mass of the electron, if that's off, then you just get protons floating in space. If you don't have this strong nuclear force to bind these things at very close ranges, you don't, get a universe compatible with life. And the fine structure constant, if it's off by 4%, you don't get carbon made in stars. So with these incredible numbers, and James and I were in a debate, and he said, look at these numbers, they're just astronomical. What do you think the chances are that God's behind this thing?
I have no idea. I do not rule out the possibility of a God existing that had something to do with the formation of the universe. However, I do rule out the possibility of, if that God exists, that God being a personal God, or at least definitely it is not the Christian God. So is there a force out there? Maybe. Is that force a force of nature? Could be. I mean, there's no reason why it couldn't be a force of nature. Would you call it a god if it was a force of nature? I wouldn't, but I know some people do. So I don't know. If you
Okay,
don't mind, I'd really like to respond to to Phil's comment in
sure.
the chat.
Yeah.
Phil, do you want to read your comment or do you want me to?
Are you talking about the one that starts out
Fallacy of begging the
begging the
question.
question? Oh,
Yeah.
you can read it.
Okay. Phil said, fallacy of begging the question that God hasn't revealed himself in the way the atheist arbitrarily says he should does not mean he hasn't revealed himself in the best way possible in history. Okay, my first response to that is, I didn't ask for God to reveal himself in any particular way. I said, whatever he knows, which isn't my arbitrarily deciding how he should do it, but rather what God in his infinite knowledge knows would be effective. And to say, well, he's revealed himself in history, not only, first of all, history is actually the straw that broke the camel's back for me. I think Bill was probably about to get to this in a minute, but I told you I pivoted at that point to universalism, but the straw that broke the camel's back for me was when Aaron Ra said, we know that the flood didn't happen, and we know this because of biology, geology, history. And when he said the word history, that was, poof, my faith disappeared because I suddenly realized it bridged the gap between what I knew of history and what I knew of the Bible and realized that they were incompatible. They cannot coexist. And because biblical inerrancy was the foundation of my faith, it was the bedrock of my faith just fell because it no longer had a foundation.
Do you want to respond, Phil?
I think if we were to engage in that kind of discussion in any depth, it would take far longer than what we have available tonight. So I would just like to hear from Gigi tonight and try to understand as much as possible. I'm not sure that I would want to make this a debate. I think it's more of a sharing time, and so and by the way, if I was to respond in any way, I would respond by saying you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of people who have a lot of struggles with the historicity of the Bible and of Christianity. But there's two questions that are always involved in a discussion with an atheist, and that is, are you rejecting the existence of God per se, or are you rejecting the existence, or are you rejecting the truth of Christianity? Because they're two separate things.
Yes.
And
yes.
So I appreciated that you said that there may be some kind of God out there. You just don't think it's the God of the Bible.
Correct.
And there could be lots and lots of productive discussions that we could have on that subject. Because if there is something that you could properly call God, and I think that most atheists understand what they mean when they use the term God, because if they didn't, they wouldn't go to the trouble of not believing in him. And that's one of the comments that I made in my book. So there's lots and lots of bunny trails and lots of rabbit holes that we could go down with all those things, and it's just beyond the scope of what we could cover in an evening like this.
I should have you on as a guest on my show, and I
was thinking the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, here's my view on Christianity. What's so amazing, if it wasn't for the Apostle Paul spreading it to the Mediterranean, to the population centers, do you realize that Christianity would be a small sect of Judaism because he opened it up? He had the genius of saying, hey, you can eat pork sandwiches. You don't have to get castrated. So if it wasn't for this tightly wound, repressed homosexual, we wouldn't have Christianity. It probably would have died out in Jerusalem. How do you feel about that?
I really could not respond to that because I do not know. I do not know how fast or how well Christianity was spread without Paul. I really don't know.
Okay, well, let's and I ask Christians this all the time. Obviously, there's a lot of evidence for the truth of Christianity. It was birthed in Jerusalem, where it could be easily falsified. You have skeptics like Paul and James, his own brother, that suddenly and radically became transformed into believers in Christ. You have some of the witnesses that did go through some persecution, did do things which, why would you do that for a lie? So what do you think the chances are that Christianity is true with so much evidence for it?
10%.
That's what I say. And I think it's probably because, we're in a Christian culture. We have all this bias that we even give it 10% because the claims are just astounding, but we're so used to it because of our culture that we don't really consider. But that's interesting you said that, because the Christians will never answer that. I've asked Tim McGrew, all sorts of Christians, they just won't answer. Bart Ehrman, I don't think would even answer it. So thanks for answering it. It's very generous.
I believe
Kelly,
Dr. Michael Dean has a question.
Yes. Michael, did
Sorry,
you want
sorry,
to
running.
unmute? There you go.
Okay, yeah. Hi there, Ms. Granny, if that's really your name.
You may call me Granny, or if you prefer, you can call me Kelly.
Okay, Kelly. I just got off a long phone call with a buddy, got back from India. Sorry, running late. I missed the first part. I'm out of school, but oh well, that's the way it goes. The one thing what you said, GG, that was troubling to me is over the years. Now, I'm not as old as James Walker, but I've been around for quite a number of years. And it seems to me, oftentimes, that some of my atheist buddies and people I know of will go on and write books and make videos and such, claiming atheism with absolute certainty, metaphysical, if you will forgive me, certainty. However, sometimes when I will talk to them or they're confronted in a venue such as this, they suddenly, oh, no, 10% chance that God exists. And so my question is, you do have the moniker of Godless Granny, so I guess you're mostly Godless Granny. And yes, I'm taking a cheap shot, but hey, I'm a little cranky tonight, Okay, what can I say? Too much caffeine. So I hope you forgive my glibness. But nevertheless, and I'm not commenting on you being a former lawyer, which is tremendous strength of mind, but nevertheless, to not say anything. But the point is, so you're not going to be, and I'm poking you a little, but I think rightly so, because oftentimes people come on and they say, Godless Granny, you're an atheist, but you're not really Godless Granny.
Yes, I am.
And I had not, let me just finish my little ramble and you can correct me, which I almost certainly do need. And so it just seems like many atheists over the years say this, but when you confront them, they do this. This happens in creation evolution all the time. The evolutionists are really hardcore naturalistic evolution until you talk to them, like one of my family members, who's a PhD guy, teaches at New Mexico, until you confront them, and then they're suddenly open-minded about everything. So do you freely confess that God could exist in your videos, or are you going to leave this meeting and go right back to being Godless Granny again?
Well, okay, I am Godless Granny right now, and I will continue to be Godless Granny after this meeting, because even though I acknowledge that it is possible that there is a God out there that I don't know about it, I have no gods. I am godless.
So you're taking it on a leap of faith?
No, I'm thinking that I don't just believe things for no reason. And while I don't rule out the possibility of life on another planet, that doesn't mean I believe that there is life on another planet. I think it's entirely possible, and I put the possibility of life on another planet far higher than I do the possibility of a God existing. But I'm not going to say I believe in life in another planet just because it's possible.
Yeah, but if you called yourself No Life on Other Planets Granny and you went around calling yourself that, but you really did believe it's possible, like 10% chance, wouldn't that raise questions about you?
But again, my moniker is not there are no gods, Granny. My moniker is godless. I have no gods. And I have no God now, and I won't have any God tomorrow either.
I think what we're hitting on, both of us here, both of you guys in this, is we've had conversations off and on in the book club. How certain do you have to be an atheist, or to be a good atheist? And we talked about the difference between soft atheist and hard atheist. We've had conversations about this. You have to be 100% sure. And I think you're right, Kelly, that it's a philosophical problem to say that you are absolutely certain that there is no God. I mean, you can't really prove a negative.
Right.
And so I think you're acknowledging that, and I'm seeing many atheists will do the same thing. So it's just saying you don't have to be 100% certain. I've had the same conversation, of course, with Bill Cluck, and I've told Bill, if I had a 10% possibility that I could win the lottery, I would play every time it was offered to me. I would play every week.
I would not.
Well, if you had a 1 in 10 chance of winning,
well, yeah, I suppose if you play 10 times, then
exactly. That's that to me, that's not bad odds. But
well, I do want to mention here,
can a Christian be 100% certain that there is a God? And again, you could put the shoe on the other foot, and
that's what I was about to do.
A lot of Christians will say yes to that, but I would say that maybe the only Christian who never doubts is the one who never thinks. And if you think, you will have questions and doubts. And we this came up in our debate here in Arlington with Bill and I, when we were talking about that. Even the great John the Baptist had his doubts when he's in prison about to be beheaded, and a lot of times there's emotional doubt. And I've had times of doubt in my life as a Christian. I've had good doubt when I was a Mormon. I went through periods of doubt that later became a crisis of faith. I would consider all that to be good doubt, and I think it helped me. Now, a lot of my atheist friends would say, "Well, James, you just need to have more of that doubt now of your Christianity," and we can have that discussion. I'm with you on the possibility. But one thing I like about the club is we can talk about those things and where that area of certainty lies. And we don't want to, as Christians, I don't think, have a type of faith which is a leap of faith that Mike talked about, that we just want it to be true, and we're just going to, hope for the best and jump out there and hope something catches us when we jump off that cliff. No, yeah. We want to have a reasonable faith. So a faith, I don't think, is the absence of evidence or lack of evidence or evidence to the contrary, but it is a reasonable belief based on the evidence that we have. That's my position.
Yeah, I want to put a cap on it. Yeah, I should have started with something nice, but I'm getting ready to watch Biden speak here, so I'm in kind of a crabby mood. So excuse me to bring politics in. But nevertheless, I want to compliment you, Godless Granny. It's a tremendous thing for you to confess what you did. And I think that's the kind of intellectual honesty I pray I can have. And I think that's tremendous. Well done. Well done.
Thank you.
Oh, to follow up on what Brother James said, I believe it was Dwight Pentecost said, he's a famous Christian theologian guy. He was so old. He he forgot when he was converted, by the way. Now that's being old. But Pentecost said something. I think Pentecost said that he's not sure that people can be 100% for sure because of the sin nature. So how's that? Okay. Well, anyway, thank you for answering my little blurb, Godless Granny. Thank you.
You are welcome.
I would agree with that. I have not only the problems of sin, but also there's a lot of other problems with our ability and capacity. So my position on that is that we are created in the image of God, and thus we can have confidence in our ability to reason because it came from a God who created that ability to reason. But the sin has marred that and has affected it. It hasn't destroyed it, but it has compromised it. And this, therefore, and this is the thing, the eye opener for me, being in this book club for 6 years, man. I have seen both sides of the aisle on this point to the exact same evidence to make the opposite point. And so you begin to see why we have the possibility of these fallacies, and it's helped me to be able to see them in my own life, a confirmation bias and these other things that you can be aware of, but we never can completely ever overcome, I don't think. But hopefully the club helps us do that. But on that line, when I heard your story, that as Daniel Ray interviewed you, and your kind of journey, your journey from being a Christian, a Calvinist Christian, and then a doubting Christian, and then a brief Universalist. But on this journey towards Godless Granny destination, you did talk about this epiphany moment, with you mentioned again here with Aaron Ra and the Noah's flood. But before that, and you mentioned it again tonight, there was this hiddenness of God. If God, if God is all knowing and all powerful, he certainly could give me the evidence he knew I would need to be able to believe if he really wanted me to. But I think maybe that journey even started back a little bit earlier. And, I debated whether to bring this up because it's such a heart-rending part of your story and emotional to me to hear it, emotional part of your story. But when we had Bart Ehrman, former Christian, now agnostic, author, a couple of times on the club, he mentioned during the club that he wrote, we were talking about his book, Misquoting Jesus. And it's basically what you were talking about. It's a kind of an attack on inerrancy or even reliability to some degree of the New Testament documents. And of course, that's where his PhD is in textual criticism. But he said this, it was interesting. He said, I would still be a Christian if that was the only issue. But it goes to me to a much bigger issue, which is the problem of evil. And he had written another book called God's Problem, and it talks about the problem of evil. And I know, I don't want to put words in Bart Ehrman's mouth, but I'm thinking he probably wouldn't be the same kind of Christian I am, but he would be maybe some kind of Christian if he only lost his faith in the inerrancy of the Bible, and even the reliability of the Bible. He still, I think, would have had room for some kind of belief in God and maybe even Jesus, had it not been for this problem. But I saw an element of that maybe, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but when you talked about losing your baby and where was God, it was very touching to me. And was that maybe the real genesis of the journey to Godless Granny?
I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is, first, I did not deconvert for another 35 years after that.
Wow.
And second, I was able to resolve that on my own. And the resolution I came to was basically the Calvinist resolution, which is, this is God's sovereignty, Romans 8:28, as long as I love God, he will find some way to make this for the best. But since you brought that up, I came up with this question just earlier today, and I'm really interested in hearing how any Christian would respond to this. And that is, we know from science that 70 to 80% of all conceptions result in either failure to implant or a miscarriage. That only about 20 to 30% of all conceptions result in a baby being born. And this is not, human abortion. This is natural failure to implant, or a natural miscarriage. And I know most Christians think that these babies, these unborn conceptions, go straight to heaven. If God can create the vast majority of life to go straight to heaven without ever coming to earth for any reason, why does earth exist at all? Why not just make all of us in heaven and have us sinless and, forget all this stuff that displeases him so much?
I would just, right off the top of my head, it's a good question. Good question. And I don't know the answer to the question. I don't think that's any verse in the Bible that specifically addresses that question that way. My first thought on that would be that sin, sickness, death, human sin, sickness, and death, at least, at the very minimum, goes back to that fall. And basically, that's why we're seeing all death is directly related to the fall and the human problem of sin.
But if he never made earth, there would be no fall. He would just make humans in heaven and forget earth.
Well, yeah. And again, not knowing the mind of God, I could propose, what was that movie where the guy gets to play God? I guess there's been several movies like that, come to think of it. But it's, everybody, he gets online and everybody's praying to win the lottery. He says yes to all of them. It ends up being a disaster, so it's like, but yeah, I could, in my own sinful human nature, I think I can think of a lot of better ways than God to do things. Just let me be God. I'll show you how good it would be. But I'm saying that realizing how bad I would be at the job of being God. But yeah, we don't know the mind of God. So we will say that God is good all of the time. It doesn't mean that it feels good all the time. It doesn't mean that we know the reason all the time. But in the nature of God, we know that God is omnibenevolent. He is totally good all of the time. And in heaven, we don't know the answer to those kind of things. We don't know how it's going to work out. We do know that the Bible indicates that every tear will be dry. I don't think anybody is going to stand before God, Christian or non-Christian, and shake their fist in God's face and say, you were wrong about this. I could have done it better. But while I don't believe we can do that, I still don't know the answer to your question. And so I can give a theodicy. I can give possible answers ad hoc, but again, I really don't know the answer to that. So my answer, the way I deal with it, is to say that I am not God. And so it's outside of my pay grade to be able to address that. But I do trust the God that I believe in to be able to answer it one day.
Yeah, well, I'll throw it in here. It's possible that I'm in the 1% of clarinet teachers in the world as far as ability. Okay, I'm 61 years old. I've taught since 1981. I was a professor for 25 years. I'm recognized around the world because of my blog. Okay, I've successfully had people playing professionally. Okay,
that's almost like being a God, isn't it?
There's a thin line between tenure and divinity, but let's not go there, as Phil indicated. Yes. Okay. No, I could say a lot on that one. Okay, but anyway, but nevertheless, the point is, when I'm teaching, so Gigi, if you were taking clarinet lessons with me, a great idea, by the way, if anybody's interested. And I said, okay, you need to do this and this and this. And you're like, well, I don't know about that. Doesn't make sense to me. Would it be reasonable to trust my expertise? I think it would be. Doesn't mean I can't be wrong. See, I'm not a professor anymore. But I might not be right, but I'm probably right. Okay. And I think we do this all the time in life, like the dentist. Oh, man. Okay. We do this all the time in life because, as we all know, there's limits to our knowledge. Okay. And it seems to me not on the reason you would trust me is based on my other credentials, not on the one question you don't have an answer to. Okay. It's reasonable to trust me on clarinet stuff. How much more is it that there's a God who created the world out of nothing, and et cetera, and does those constants and all this kind of stuff? And so therefore, a very difficult question. You know, certainly I thought about it myself. We don't really know. Okay. But it's reasonable to trust me on clarinet. Reasonable, I think, to trust God on a matter as poignant as that. My 2 cents.
By the way, thank you. Speaking of limitations of knowledge, Joel Thomas rightly named that movie Bruce Almighty. Thank you, Joel. Appreciate that.
By the way, so why wouldn't you trust Bart Ehrman and Dale Allison, who both supreme scholars have come to the same conclusion? Jesus is best viewed as an apocalyptic prophet, a failed apocalyptic prophet who had a bad week in Jerusalem. Wouldn't you agree with that, Double G, that we shouldn't lean on our own understanding, but trust the scholars that know this stuff?
I think we have to test everything. I mean, even the scholars are fallible.
Not Bart Ehrman, Bart Ehrman, yes. Dale Allison, no. Absolutely.
I would like to address Phil's point, though, that because everyone in heaven would be a robot incapable of love. And I'm wondering, Phil, do you think that all of the unborn that God is taking and sending straight to heaven, that all of those are robots incapable of love?
I think God wants people in heaven that are there because they want him, because they want to love him. I think God wants people to have a relationship with him. He wants them to have a love relationship with him. That's why he didn't create us just popped into heaven. He created us on this earth so that we could make a decision as whether or not we want him. And if everybody was just simply created in heaven and automatically had a love relationship with him, they wouldn't have a choice in the matter. And you cannot force someone to love you. God is not going to force anyone to love him.
Okay. But the question still remains that of the humans that live on this planet, no more than 1/3 choose him, and it's probably far less than that. And yet 70 to 80% of every human ever in existence went straight to heaven, if you believe that babies go to heaven, which would mean that 90% of the population of heaven is all going to be people who never lived on earth ever. So is 90% of the population of heaven all people who were forced to love God?
I don't necessarily believe that all unborn babies or all babies before they reach the age of accountability are automatically going to be forced to live in heaven.
Okay. So they can be raised in limbo until they can make a choice?
What I believe is that if a baby dies before they can make a decision for God one way or another, they do not go to hell.
Okay. Do they go to limbo?
I don't know. Well, I don't know what you would call it, but my personal perspective on this, and I can't prove this in a laboratory, but my personal perspective on this is that if a baby dies before they can make a decision for God, then they are presented with the option to go to heaven or go to hell. And if a baby doesn't want God, then I don't think God is going to force them to live in heaven. You cannot force someone to love you. Forced love is a contradiction in terms. So that's the only way that I can deal with that issue. And I know that it's not popular, but I absolutely reject, my Calvinist brothers and sisters who believe in infant damnation, because if someone was not part of the elect and they died when they were 3 months old, if they weren't part of the elect, then they have to go to hell.
Right.
And I reject that. But I also reject the possibility that God is going to force someone to live with him for eternity, even if they don't want to. God cannot force you to love him, and God will not force you to love him.
Phil,
Can
Phil,
you
are
love
you a
someone you don't know?
Molinist?
I'm sorry, James, go ahead.
I was wondering, I have not talked with him about that. So Phil, are you a Molinist or believe in middle knowledge?
I'm a mere Molinist. I'm what Tim Stratton would call a mere Molinist, and he's one of my best friends, by the way. And a mere Molinist simply believes that we human beings have libertarian free will, even fallen human beings have libertarian free will, and that God has middle knowledge. So I accept mere Molinism, but I'm not in the
chat. For those in the club that may not know these terms, could you define them for us? Middle knowledge.
Libertarian free will is the idea that antecedent conditions do not necessitate all of our decisions and choices. That our decisions and choices are not determined by antecedent conditions or antecedent necessity. And middle knowledge is the idea that traditionally theologians have believed that God has two kinds of knowledge, natural knowledge and free knowledge. And I don't remember the exact difference between the two. I always get the two confused, but natural knowledge, I believe, is knowledge that God gains simply because he's omniscient. And free knowledge is the knowledge that God gains as he observes what occurs in the universe that he did not determine. He still knows those things as well. Middle knowledge is the knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which is basically the idea that God knows what every creature would have chosen given a certain set of circumstances. So I don't know if that helps or not, but those are kind of the high level definitions of those.
Maybe a way of summarizing it is that the questions that you're raising, Bill and Godless GG and really all of our atheist friends some way or another, these are good questions, and these are questions that Christians have spent a lot of time thinking about, and there's different approaches to it. And there's the 5-point Calvinist approach, and then there's the middle knowledge approach. Catholics have their spin on it and all, but this is something that obviously the Bible hasn't spoken that very clearly on this issue.
Right. And
therefore there is room for having different opinions. Of course, mine is the only correct one. I know that, but no, in all seriousness, I don't know which ones of mine may or may not be correct. And sometimes it's a work in progress, but it's good questions that do deserve answers. And it's something that a lot of thinking Christians have not ignored. And they've been ahead of us on having those questions and having thought through it and to try to deal with that. So,
by the way, Ken, do you have anything to say? Are you excited about being on Saturday?
Yeah, I look forward to whatever Godless Granny is going to ask me. I get to share my story, and I always enjoy doing that. So,
now, do you have any real questions for her, or are you going to give her any softball questions today?
Well, I do have a question. I just wanted to follow up on, just to give a thought on that embryo thing. It's something I've thought about for some time as well. The angle that I've thought about is that it seems to me by their actions or their non-concern about that situation. By the way, I think the percentage that I've seen is between 50 and 60%, but that's just quibbling. If it's true that between 50 and 80% of all embryos that have a soul perhaps are spontaneously dying before they get a chance to take their first breath, if Christians really believe that those were those were true humans, imagine if 10-year-olds, if there was a disease that wiped out 50 to 80% of all 10-year-olds, there would be drives of March of Dimes, whatever it is people would be giving up their hard-earned income to find a cure for this situation. But nobody I've ever met has had any concern for these 50 to 80% souls that perish prematurely. There's just no concern for them.
You don't think there's any concern? I'm sorry to jump in there, but medical scientists have been working on that problem for years, and they have actually made certain advances in that area, so that more embryos survive than before.
Well, I think if there is a concern, it's mostly around the ability of a woman to conceive if they're having problems conceiving. They don't really necessarily shed any tears for the embryos that actually die for those that have 10 kids already. It doesn't seem like there's really any emotional attachment to them. I guess that stands to reason because you don't see them, but I just don't. I think there's probably a disconnect between the theory and the practice in terms of what people believe about these souls and what they actually, how much they really care about them. That's just my perspective. But
well, if you don't mind, can I just follow up on that Molinism question just real quickly, and then I'll try to shut up for a while. A Molinist has what I think is a reasonable and feasible answer to the question of infants dying before they can make a decision for God. And what the Molinist would say, and by the way, this is what the advanced Molinist would say. I'm a mere Molinist. I'm not an advanced Molinist. I'm not a level 4 Molinist. But the advanced Molinist would say that God will judge them or bring them either to heaven or will reject them based on whether they would have made a decision for him had they lived long enough to make a decision. And so that's where the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom come in. So if God knows that if they had not died so early, that they eventually would have made a decision for Christ and for God at some point in the future and some point in their lives, then he could base his decision on whether or not they're going to spend eternity with him on that. And most Molinists will say that to deny that God has that middle knowledge would be to deny that God is omniscient. So I think the Molinist has an attractive answer to that question, although I wouldn't go to the wall for that and say that's the absolute certain answer and that's the only possible answer available to us. So
Phil, what makes you a mere Molinist? What does the mere part mean?
A mere Molinist just means that they affirm those two propositions, that man has libertarian freedom and that God has middle knowledge.
Would God?
Okay, but whether that applies to judgment or not, that's the more advanced modalist. Right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
okay.
Like I said, I'm not an advanced Molinist, because an advanced Molinist will say that God knew if he had created world X, that someone would make decision 1, and that if he created world Y, that same person would have made decision 2, because there were two different circumstances that would occur in both of those worlds. And so he chose to create the world in which he knew that the majority or the greatest number of people would make a decision for him. And that's the world that he chose.
I don't want to anticipate Kelly's concern about that, except to say what she might be thinking is, if he could do that, why even create this one world? Just do away with it.
No, that's not where I was going.
Okay, I'm sorry. What have you got for us, Kelly?
I wanted to ask, does God extend the same courtesy to someone who never had the opportunity to get to know him, either because they were raised in a place where Christianity was unheard of, or maybe they were raised in an area where they were given a faith that they thought was genuine, but it was not the faith that God wanted them to have. It's a completely different faith, but they never had any reason to question that faith. Will God give them that same opportunity by explaining who he is after they die, even though they've already reached the age of accountability?
Are you asking me, or are you just
yes,
that
I'm
question
asking
out generally? Oh, yeah, I don't know. There are a lot of questions that I, as a Christian, don't have the answers to. There are some Christians who have proposed certain answers to that question. For example, Frank Turek would say that God will make his revelation, he will reveal himself to everyone he knows would accept it had they heard it, and that the people who never heard of Jesus were the people who never would have made a decision for him, even if they had.
That's
Now,
a good answer.
and I don't necessarily agree or disagree with that. I think it's reasonable. I don't think it's unreasonable. I just don't know that I could, that's another one of those things that I could go to the wall for. I just think that there are a lot of options and there are a lot of possible answers to those questions. And what I would say overall is that the fact that we may not have the answers to those questions does not have any bearing on whether Christianity is true or false, and it has no bearing on whether theism is true or false. It just,
I think what does have a bearing on whether or not Christianity is true or false is if this God has the character claims that you claim he does, that this is a loving God, why would he make such people in the first place that he knows are going to end up being tortured for eternity?
Well, look, you're just like my students who don't want to practice. It is not fair. I have to practice. All you do in lessons is talk. You worry on all this stupid stuff on ambush. You waste my time, and they don't like it. But I know best because I'm Clarinet Mike. Okay, and you should trust me because I'm Clarinet Mike. You can come up with all these reasons. You can complain about me in student evaluations, which they did. Okay, and whine like 2-year-olds. But the truth is, you need to trust me on clarinet playing. I'm not unsympathetic with your concern, but honestly, there's a lot of stuff we don't know in this world, and you should trust me on clarinet playing. How much more should you trust the God who has, I believe, revealed himself? I gotta go.
That's the issue. You believe this God has revealed himself. I do not. And until he does reveal himself, I'm not going to trust you that this God really exists and really wants what you claim that he wants.
Well, we will
reluctantly trust you on the clarinet stuff, though.
You still better practice, though. Thank you for Godless Granny. I do appreciate it very much, your honesty. Thank you. Got to go.
Hey, Kelly, I certainly don't know the answer to your question on the Molinism as far as for people who haven't heard, but just sitting around at Bible college talking about it in the break room, which you have all these, so-called freshman experts, it almost seemed to me that was exactly why it was developed, to answer that question, what about those who never heard? Well, middle knowledge was the way of explaining that. So now I don't know that is actually true or not, but the way it was when I first heard of it, seemed to be the very reason it came into popularity.
By the way, Kelly, go ahead.
Sorry, the other possible answer or the other option is coming from the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1. He said that God's invisible attributes have been clearly seen by what has been made, so men are without excuse. And some people have developed a little bit of an ideology out of that says that God judges people based on the knowledge that they have available to them, even if they haven't heard the gospel specifically. And I think that's a valid option. But I think the fact that all of these things are valid options and are not unreasonable, I think that they pretty much cast kind of a black cloud over the possibility that these questions are fatal to Christianity. Like these questions actually obliterate Christianity and smash it into pieces and make it so that it cannot possibly be true.
Well, Phil, I'll tell you the silver bullet that obliterates Christianity is the outsider test of faith. I don't know if you're familiar with John Loftus' thing, Godless Granny? Kelly?
No.
Okay, what it says is there's two things that determine your faith: your parents, your peers, and where you were born. If you're born in Saudi Arabia, you're going to be Muslim. If you're born in South America, you're going to be Catholic. We don't realize the enormous influence culture has. And if I've listened to some Muslims' testimony, they never even hear a word about Jesus. It's totally foreign to them. And that's what determines your faith. It's not you sit down and make a rational decision.
Hey,
Oh,
Bill,
by the way,
we've already had that book club.
yeah, okay.
And what we saw is we go around our room in our own book club and we all break that rule. I'm not still a Mormon. You're not still a Christian. Godless Granny is not, didn't start off godless. Every one of us. Ken Daniel breaks that rule. We have more people who break that rule than keep that rule. Plus, John Loftus, sitting right here in this book club, failed his own test. He refused to look at even an atheist book that had the proposition that Jesus really existed. He refused to even read the book. That is failing his own outsider test of faith.
Anyway, you're going to interview Brady, right? Brady, aren't you going to be on Double G's show?
Yeah, a week from Saturday, July 20th.
And
let's do a 1-minute commercial about that episode.
Well, wait a minute. What we both hope for, me and Double G, is you're finally going to answer the question of the Jerusalem Galilee appearance.
Well, I'm going to do my best. That's for sure.
Hey, I'll tune in for that one because that has been a while since I need a refresher course on that.
Go ahead, Brady.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, so a week from this Saturday, so about 9-10 days away, something like that. I'm actually going to be I'm going to be in Utah, Granny. We're gonna be in Utah, James and I, Dan, the whole group. Yeah, we'll look forward. We're going to look at try to answer that question. Where did Jesus ascend from? When you look at two of the Gospels, he's obviously ascending from the Mount of Olives, but yet the other two Gospels have Jesus' last recorded words. It just seems rather obvious that it is the Galilee. So
and that's a long way apart. Tell them that. So
you're talking about in that day and time, you're looking at really a 2-day journey. So it's not far at all. Now, even today in a car, it's an hour or two. You can get there, but that's in a car going pretty fast. So we're going to look at that and maybe some other resurrection inconsistencies, as Granny has put it. Which by the way, I really appreciate calling them an inconsistency because I think it indicates that okay, we're open to an explanation, but this just doesn't seem right on the front end. And so we're going to delve into that, and I think we'll have a real nice conversation about it.
I'm looking forward to it.
Where can they find your channel?
Godless Granny on YouTube.
It's youtube.com/Godless Granny, all one word.
Well, just if you open the YouTube chat, the YouTube app, and then you just type in Godless Granny, you'll find me.
Okay. Gotcha.
I think she's the only Godless Granny that's out there, so that's the benefit.
Actually, there's other Godless Grannies, they just don't use that name.
Yes.
Really? Well, okay. Well, yeah, that's what I meant. Going by
you need to get the trademark on it before everybody else tries to steal it.
That's right.
By the way, Double G, how do you feel about your channel in general, the success of it? Because it's very frustrating to me that Cosmic Skeptic has like 1 million subscribers. I mean, these young kids or Paula G, as you well know, who does an excellent job. He deserves all the credit he gets, but it seems that we're judged by the number of subs we have.
Yeah, it's true. We are judged by the number of subs we have, but hey, I can't hold a candle to Alex O'Connor. That man is brilliant. And I think he's going to be the next Christopher Hitchens. So I do not begrudge him his success. I think he's got a good career, going in front of him. Paula Gia, I don't think I can hold a candle to him either. I think my work is 10% of the quality of his. His is so much better researched. I just think he is so much better. If you look at the episode that we did together, the collab that he put out, he made me look good. I gave him some material, and what he did with that material, he made me look even better than I do.
Well, I remember Jim Hall, who used to be a member. I said, do you know, his counterpart, Suzanne or whatever? And he goes, oh, she's Susie Q or Susan Q,
Shannon
Shannon
Q?
Q, who's good, but it's like, oh no, she has 40,000 subs. I'm nothing. I'm nothing compared to her. And he could never get above 8,000 subs, and he just quit.
Mm-hmm.
It's really sad. So, but you
Well,
feel good
Bill,
about what you are doing, and
I
so
do.
yeah.
I do.
so Bill, when are we going to have our next debate?
Oh, anytime. Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. Yeah, it was so funny. I was trying to teach them that Timothy was not written by Paul. And the minister comes and says, ever learning, but never coming to the truth. And then he goes and says, Paul wrote Timothy. So, you know, it's just very frustrating. Do you get frustrated about trying to get through to these Christians that just do not see the contradictions, do not see the problems?
I do. I do. There's some places where I see genuine disagreement, and I don't have a problem with that. And there's places where I see, genuine questions, and I don't have a problem with that. But when someone's telling you something that is so obviously false, and you point it out, and they insist that they are right anyway, that's what gets frustrating. I recently had a conversation with a Christian who did not do that. He posted an article about evolution, and the title of the article made a bold claim, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but the article did not support that claim. And he was boldly proclaiming that, evolution had been disproven by this. And I said, your own article doesn't support that. Read it. And so he read it. He said, yeah, you're right. And he took it down.
Well, when I was around your area, I visited Dinosaur Adventureland with Kent Hovind. And I just realized no matter what I said, he wasn't listening or cared about what I had to say. So, I mean, he did listen some, and everybody was very nice to me. I mean, it was one of the great experiences I've ever had. So, it's just like, it's frustrating. Eric, the same way. Eric's a bright guy, Eric Hovind. And he took me to the Institute for Creation Research, where you have legitimate PhDs that know more than we do about geology and paleontology, but yet they believe the universe is 6,000 years old. So
I think there's a lot of tropes on both sides where there's these stock arguments that Christians use against atheism, some of which have been debunked, but yet keep getting recycled. But atheists do the same. I mean, there are certain things that we or people in our camp will tend to use that Christians have ably given responses to. It's equal opportunity on both sides. But I just wish there could be more. And this is what's valuable about a group like this, where we can talk things through and hopefully come to a point where we'll stop using arguments that are fallacious.
Yeah, it helps us hopefully to have better arguments, whichever side of the fence we're on that kind of thing. Now, Kelly, when you shared your story with us, you're Godless Granny, but there's not Godless Granddaddy. So your husband is
my husband is still a believer.
Is still a believer. Can you just take a few minutes and talk about that relationship? And this is like you agree to disagree. Tell us, how does that work?
Well, okay. When I was a believer, I was the one that was always driving the train. When we were first married, my husband asked me, can't we just be pew sitters? No, we have to do everything. If the church doors are open, we are there. And, in addition to that, I was, I've sang in the choir. I was involved in home ladies Bible studies. I taught VBS. I went on mission trips. I did everything I could. So I think if anything, he might have been relieved when I became an atheist, because now he can do what he's wanted to do all along, which is just be a pew sitter. And, he loved when the pandemic hit, because now he takes his computer and goes in the bedroom and watches his church service. And when it's over, he's done his church for the week. But as far as, the topics of Christianity, those are off limits. And this is pure speculation on my part. But I really suspect that he's afraid that if we talked about it, I would talk him out of his faith.
So
Yeah.
it was it's something that uh, on a practical level, just the attending church and stuff like that, it seems like it was kind of a wash on that kind of thing. But when it comes to the very issues, you know, is the Bible true? You know, did Jesus rise from the dead? That's you haven't really had those
He
conversations,
doesn't want to talk about that.
right? And so, and you respect that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I know that when you have a divided house, and the closest I can come to that is when I have close family members like my father, who's still Mormon, and I'm not a Mormon anymore. I'm a traditional Christian. And man, you know, for me, like I went through a 10-year period where I talked twice with my dad in 10 years, and there were other factors and stuff, but the religion was a big, you know, elephant in the room that when I did see him, I didn't feel comfortable to talk about it, and maybe he didn't either. I don't know. Now, the last couple of years of his life was a much more normal, and we did have those conversations, and it was a respectful conversation, and I learned a lot more about his position better, and he listened and understood that there were reasons why I was no longer a Mormon. It wasn't just that I was done wrong or something happened, you know. So I look back thankful that at some point late in his life we were able to have those conversations. But I can also understand wanting to keep the peace, and so that you can have a more normal relationship, having certain elements that are off limits to conversation discussion. I can understand that. So
One of my
it's
favorite passages in the New Testament is because I'm in a similar situation. My wife is a believer, as you all know, most of you know, but we just have that detente that Kelly talked about. We just those conversations are off limits. But otherwise, we have a great relationship. But in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says, "To the rest I say this: if any, or I, not the Lord, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy." So that's kind of your fire insurance right there.
wow, that sounds like a whole book club to try to break things down and discuss that. Do you feel sanctified sometimes?
I mean, well, it doesn't matter whether I do or not. It matters what the scripture says, right? I mean, if the scripture is true, then then I'm on for the ride.
One thing that
Somebody asked Bill one time, if I can't remember who that was. Bill's not there with us right now, but anyway, somebody asked Bill one time, Bill, what happens if you die and all of a sudden you're standing before God after all? And he's going to say, "Once saved, always saved." So,
I don't even remember.
Who was that? Who was that, Bill, that asked you that question?
Oh, I don't even remember saying it. That's great. Legendary embellishment. That's all it is. Double G. Don't believe him.
Just
what
remember
would you
that
say?
sanctifies doesn't necessarily mean saved.
What would you say, Kelly, if that happened?
if I was suddenly to appear before God, and I'd say, why didn't you tell me this before?
Well, you kind of did know before, though, right?
Did we lose Bill?
Yeah, we
I think
lost
we
Bill.
did.
Okay, but God never told me. You know, I read it on my own in the Bible. I heard it from preachers, but God never told me himself. And you know, I mentioned this in a video where I'm discussing Frank Turek, who describes your relationship with God as sort of being like a marriage, and I would agree with him. But if someone came to me and told me, "My friend wants to marry you," I'd say, "I'm not going to accept a proposal like that. If your friend wants to marry me, tell your friend to come here and ask me to marry him. I don't know your friend."
So
So
do you feel like maybe on the Christianity that you talked yourself into it, so that's why you could talk yourself out of it? you never really had a real revelation from God looking back on it.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
That's
But you would
accurate.
say that nobody else has it either. Nobody else has received a true revelation from God. That's the kicker right there. So
Well,
you
yeah,
can't make
because
a
if there's no
distinction
God, you're
between-
right. Then
Right. Yeah.
nobody
So you
did.
can't make a distinction between Godless Granny's experience and the experience of somebody else who remains in the faith. They both equally, from her perspective, never had a real revelation from God to begin with. So there's no
One thing I came to realize is when I looked back on my life at all of the things that I thought were revelations from God, answers to prayer, and so forth, there's nothing that ever happened that could not have happened in the exact same way if there was no God.
Yeah, I've had those same questions because of trying to reevaluate my Mormon experience. It was very experiential. There's what they call the burning in the bosom, this testimony that you get. And I believed it, and I prayed the prayer, and I felt the feelings, and trying to go back, what did I really feel? Was it just my imagination? Was there something demonic there? Was it exactly what was that? And so for me, I think maybe I let the pendulum swing too far in the opposite direction. So it's just like I don't put any faith or confidence at all in feelings or experience. And so really a better way of thinking of it, I think, in more recently, I think of it this way. It's not that you shouldn't have a religious experience, but a religious experience alone is not sufficient. So maybe it's necessary, but not sufficient. If you didn't have it, if there was no experience to go with it, then that would make the whole thing seem empty. But the problem is you have all the religions having experiences, even when they contradict each other. So the experience alone is not sufficient. You would need more than just the experience. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah.
But going back
yeah.
on you, yeah, you could explain it away.
Mhm.
And the same with my Mormon experiences. What about when this happened? What about when this happened? I prayed as a Mormon and that happened, so it's, again, could have happened without God being a Mormon.
That's the big question that I have, is that if God revealed himself to you directly, how would you know it was him?
If there really is a God that's all-knowing, he would know how to do that. He would be able to convince me because he would know what would convince me.
Okay, but that's a circular argument, because you're assuming that he hasn't done it, and therefore you're assuming that God doesn't exist because he hasn't revealed himself in the way that you think he needs to reveal himself. You're saying that God has all knowledge, and therefore he knows how to reveal himself in the way that human beings can be confident that it's really him. Well, what if he has? What if he has done that?
If the Christian claims are correct, then God would be able to do that. But if the Christian claims are not correct, then you're right. God would not be able to do that. But that's the whole purpose, is it's supposed to be proving that the Christian claims are correct. So if God really is the omniscient, all-loving, all-powerful God, then he should have that ability.
So are you saying that
you're begging the question, because the question begging comes when you're saying that God hasn't done that?
Well, obviously he hasn't, because I don't believe.
But that's a fallacy, because the fact that you don't believe doesn't necessarily mean that he hasn't revealed himself adequately. So, for example, there are some people who believe, for a long time, scientists believed in this theory of phlogiston, and the fact that pretty much everybody in the scientific community believed in this theory of phlogiston. Well, eventually it was debunked. And when it was debunked, all the scientists who finally realized that the theory was false, they were all convinced that the theory was false. But what if you provide somebody absolute, irrefutable scientific evidence that a certain theory is true or false. And the fact that they don't accept your conclusion doesn't mean the theory is true or false. So what you're doing is you're conflating whether or not you could be successfully convinced on the one hand with whether or not it is absolutely convincing on the other hand. Those are two different questions.
I think there's a difference between being convinced in the truth of the thing and being convinced of the existence of God at all. Yes, it is entirely possible that an all-knowing God could provide me with sufficient information that was convincing, and I might not be convinced by it. However, if this God was real, it should be impossible for this all-knowing God not to be able to convince me of his very existence.
So are you saying that if God was all powerful, there would be no atheists?
You asking me?
No, I was asking Kelly.
Okay.
I think you need the omniscient part in there. I am the
Okay, yeah, put the two together. An omniscient God, an all-powerful
that wants
God.
everyone to know
If
him.
that existed, there would be no atheists.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. See, I think there's a huge mistake there. With all due respect, I think there's a big mistake there, because the mistake is between being convinced that something is true and something being true, but you're not convinced even though there is enough evidence to convince you. If Christianity is true, then man is living in a fallen state. And if that's the case, it's possible to present absolutely convincing and conclusive evidence that something is true to a fallen human being, and they might not be convinced by it. They have
Romans 1 earlier on that, and the God is revealing himself, his righteousness from heaven, but and I'm putting all humans, I'm not talking about atheists, all humans, we tend to suppress that truth in our own unrighteousness.
Right. So if man is fallen, then all bets are off, and you can't put these two things together. You can't put whether or not I'm convinced together with whether or not something is convincing. The fact
I could reverse the argument too, Kelly, on that, and just say that if there was sufficient truth that macroevolution and abiogenesis was true, then I would believe it. And because I don't believe it, that means there's not sufficient proof out there of it. And if it was true, then I would be convinced, and everybody would be convinced. But half the world is not convinced. Therefore, there's not sufficient proof.
Okay, but again, I would separate being convinced of the truth of Christianity with being convinced of the existence of a God. And when I said there would be no atheists, I wasn't saying that everyone would believe in Christianity. Rather, I was just saying that everyone would be convinced that God exists. And I don't, and you gave the example of this scientific proof, and not everyone accepted it. But did anyone deny the existence of the person that was presenting the evidence? No, because you could see him right there in front of you. And I think that an almighty God should be able to at least, even if my heart is so closed and my mind is so closed that I cannot accept that what this God has to say is true, he should be able to at least present enough of himself to show that he really exists.
There's a lot of assumptions being made there, but this is not necessarily the truth of Christianity. This, even if God exists, there's no way that you can simply assume with any degree of confidence that he's interested in letting you know that he exists.
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean he doesn't exist. See, there's a whole range of ideology known as deism, and that is that God created the world, that he exists, that he has all of these superpowers, but he's just not interested in interacting with creation.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's the case, he's not going to have any reason or any desire to reveal himself to you. That doesn't mean that there is no God.
Right. But and if that's the case, then it doesn't matter what I believe, because this God doesn't care one way or the other.
Right. So the question is not whether or not God exists. The question is whether or not God exists and he's interested in having a relationship with you. If he does exist and has a relationship with you and has all knowledge and is all wisdom, then he is the one that has to make the decision as to how he's going to reveal himself to all of mankind, including you, including me, including everybody here. And if he doesn't reveal himself the way that human beings say that he must in order for them to be convinced, then that doesn't mean that he doesn't exist, and it doesn't even mean that he's not interested in having a relationship with you. What it means is we have to adjust our thinking, and we have to realize that there may be other ways that God may have in his wisdom to reveal himself to us that are more effective and are more that are really going to be more that are going to lead to knowledge much more effectively, because we talked about experience. What you're talking about is you're saying that God has got to give you some kind of an experience, some kind of
No, no.
Okay.
It does not have to be an experience.
Well, but what is it going to be then? If God's going to reveal himself to you in such a way that you are convinced that he exists, what is that going to be? How is that?
Okay.
How are you going to receive that information?
Okay, first, I don't know for sure, because, I am not all-knowing. But if there is an all-knowing God, he would already know the answer to that question. But second, I did make a suggestion of one thing that I would absolutely accept as proof of a God that wants a relationship with me. And that is, if there was a Bible that no matter who picked it up, it would be in a language that they could understand, and it would be written at a level that they could understand. And the words on the page would change for whoever was touching this Bible. I would believe that there was a God that exists that had a personal message to me, because this Bible would be something personal that would be directly to me.
Okay, what you're describing is an experience. You're describing being able to use your senses to read something on a page. And then are you talking about something changing so that it's tailored to you personally and suddenly?
Yes, and not just me, but to anybody who touches it.
Well, if that's the case, how do you know that that's God communicating with you? It could be a demon communicating with you, and it could be a demon tricking you into believing in this God. See, that's why we are so committed to this idea that we can't dictate to God how he has to reveal himself to us, because it's a whole huge ball of circular logic. Because what we're saying is, God, you have to reveal yourself to me in such a way that I will be convinced, such a way that I think you should reveal yourself to me. And if you don't, then I'm not going to believe in you. And God is sitting up there saying, I decided to reveal myself in a way that will be most effective, and the way will give you knowledge, not just being convinced. Because there's a difference between being convinced of something and actually knowing something. God wants us to know that he exists. He doesn't want us to just simply be convinced, because a demon could convince us. A demon could take a hold of our brains, and a demon could take a hold of this Bible, and he could supernaturally rearrange all sorts of words just to deceive you into believing something.
And what am I supposed to believe?
What do you mean, what you're supposed to believe?
Well, okay. If I'm supposed to believe that Christianity is correct, and I'm not supposed to believe it based on any kind of experience, what is it that's supposed to be the basis of my believing that this is true, that what you say is true?
Reason.
Wait, hold on. I got a question I think that might help clear this up. So, Granny, how do you determine if something is true or not?
It depends on what it is. But basically just test it. Test it against what I know from other facts. Test it against what experts in the field are writing about it. Basically test it.
Okay. Um, it's interesting, but I don't know if I understand completely because you're just saying test it. Well, what would the test need to look like if
I
it
can give an
was?
example of that. Like, for example, how do we know that that the force of gravity is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between two bodies rather than the cube of the distance? Well, if we're able to use the Newton's theorem to be able to partially to get to the moon and back successfully, using his theorem instead, inversely proportional to the square of the distance instead of the cube of the distance, we know it's the square of the distance because if we had used the cube of the distance, we just would not have gotten to the moon and back. There's just no two ways about it. So we know that the force of gravitation is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between two bodies. So we just know that.
And what is the assumption that is being made in that whole argument? The assumption that's being made is that we are capable of successful rational thought, and that our reason can lead us to some kind of reliable conclusion. But the problem is that if there's no God, then our minds were not created to reason. We weren't designed to be reasoning people, and therefore we have no reason to trust our reason.
This is one of those tropes that I was trying to get at when I raised it a few minutes ago about arguments that people use that I just don't find convincing. I just gave you the answer, and that is that we know if the question is, are our brains, so if we're flummoxed, okay, are our brains capable of finding truth or not? Whether or not God created them or evolution created them, let's set that aside for a minute. We know that our brains are capable of getting at truth. Otherwise, we would not have been able to get to the moon and back successfully.
Yeah, but that wasn't my question, though. My question is how do we determine if something is true or not?
By pragmatic experience, did it work or not? I'm a pragmatist. I'm not a theoretical. I'm not a philosopher. I'm more of a kind of an empiricist. It's like, did it work? Did we get to the moon and back? If we didn't get to the moon and back, we didn't succeed. We didn't have the truth. If we succeeded, we know we had the truth, at least about some things, right?
Yeah,
So
but the problem though, Ken, is that whether we got to the moon and back is also another piece of knowledge that you're relying on your mind on. And so if we can't have true authentic knowledge, then we can't even know whether or not we went to the moon and back. That could simply be
we could laugh into solipsism and everything. I mean, at some point you have to say, well, we could just be brains in a vat. We could all just be we could all just be minds without a body. These are all illusions that we could, there's all kinds of things that could be or true or not. At some point you just have to say, okay, well, this is the experience that I'm living in, and that's probably, I'm not certain, but probably what I experience is what is really happening, So
I agree with you to an extent, Ken, except for the fact that it's almost like it's almost kind of like a reverse God of the gaps. You're having to give up something. You're having to give up the argument to be able for it to work, because where my question still comes into play is that how do we determine, and this isn't, to me, this has nothing to do with Christianity or atheism or any other ism that we want to put in there, is we do, because and this is where I agree with you. We do obviously seem to have minds that are capable for rational and reasonable thought. Now, whether it's, we want to go Phil's direction and say, well, it's because we had to have a created mind. I don't even want to go down that road right now, and just simply say is we have to be able to come to a place where we can determine how we can know if something's true. Epistemology. How do we know that it's true? And if we can't identify that, then for us to be able to make claims about things to be true, I mean, we could be right, but a broken clock is right twice a day.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that there's the Christian also has a potential problem in that a Christian has adopted the faith for certain reasons, right? They've used their brains to come to a conclusion that, based on, okay, well, whether it's the resurrection, evidence around the resurrection, or creation or whatever it is that convinces them, they're using their minds to come to a conclusion that what they're adopting, they're adopting a system. Once they're in the system, yes, they can use the tenets of that system to say, okay, well, this is what I believe or don't believe, but they still have to use their minds to get into that system. And so, and it just strikes me as odd that like so many apologists will be so convinced about the arguments that got them into the system, whether it's the resurrection or what have you, but yet somebody else in the Muslim faith or Mormon faith or whatever has reasons for getting into their systems as well, and we look at them and say, oh well, they're applying logic in inferior ways to mine. They overestimate the weight of the evidence that brought them into their system. Oh, but could I be possibly overestimating the weight of things that brought me into my system? Oh no, heaven forbid. My arguments are true, but that Muslims' arguments, they're overestimating the weight of that evidence. But it strikes me as hubris to say, well, I can't be overestimating the weight of the evidence that brought me into my faith.
I agree with you 100% on that, Ken. And I think that's the reason why stuff like this book club is vitally important. I mean, especially for somebody like me, because I'm not James, I'm not Granny, I'm not you, or Bill, in that, I grew up in a Christian home and trusted in Christ as an older child, 10 years old. And it wasn't until I was 18, 19 years old when I started really looking into this stuff and starting to hear the arguments. And so I've never really had that change that y'all guys have gone through. And so I respect that.
Well, count yourself fortunate because it's not fun to go through it. I'll say that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's part of where I respect it from is that you came to a place. Whether somebody thinks that you're right or wrong in your position now is immaterial to me. That you examine the evidence and based on what you believe to be true, you decided to move in a direction that you thought was true. And to me, I got a lot of respect for that, even if I disagree with the position, because I think at the end of the day, that's what we all need to be doing. We all need to be moving in the direction that we believe is true. And hopefully we all at least believe that we've made the right decision based on good evidence and not just.
Yeah. And in all honesty, this book club has been good. I mean, there's been a lot of really high quality books from the Christian side that have challenged me. So I wrote a book, back in 2009 myself, and I'm almost a little bit embarrassed about some of the arguments I made then. It's like, I've got somebody read my book recently a year ago or so and said, hey Ken, can I record it for you on Audible? It's like, well, I'm not really wedded to this that much anymore, but he really wanted to do it, so I'm letting him do it. He's almost done.
Come out with the second edition.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we're kind of neglecting Kelly here a little bit. She's our guest. I do want to hear Kelly a little bit more about what you said about how we can arrive at knowledge. And I think Brady's question is a lot deeper than most people realize, because when he said, how do you arrive at knowledge? How do you know things? And your answer was, well, because we can test things. And so what I would suggest, based on that, is that if you think that we can test things and then arrive at knowledge, before you can do that, you have to know that those tests are valid tests. And you have to know that those tests are actually able to bring you to authentic knowledge. And so
I'm not willing to go to global skepticism.
So the question is, how do you know that the tests that you are using in order to try to put these knowledge claims to the test, how do you know that those tests are reliable? And so that's really the heart of the question, is that where do we get a working epistemology? And I'll give you a little bit of a little preview of next week or next month, because James talked about we could focus on specific chapters of my book, and I would focus on the chapter of the book called Knowledge in Crisis. And in that chapter, I deal with how is it that someone, if God does not exist, how is it that we can arrive at authentic knowledge? And that's where I want to know where you think your knowledge of the validity of these tests come from. If you have a, if you can make a comment on that.
The best I can do, I'm not very well versed in philosophy. So I would have to say that the best I can do is they've been reliable for me in the past. And thus, I believe they can be in the future as well. I think that because I read extensively and I look at what other people have to say, I can gather from that the best thought that is available to me. But as far as your question goes, is can I know for certain that what I believe is true? No, I can't. But I also don't think that your way of looking at it is any better, because if I can't know anything because and this is exactly what Ken was getting at. If I can't know anything because I don't know what for sure whether or not an idea I have is right or wrong, and I can't test to know for sure, neither can you. Even if there is a God that created us, this God would have, we know that this God created us to believe false things, if there is such a God, because people believe false things. And so if we know that this God created us to believe false things, how do we know that there even is a God that created us in the first place? And I don't see how we can possibly get there other than global skepticism. And I'm not willing to go there.
Well, there's a slight inaccuracy there, though, because if God created us and he created us with the ability to know things, and we make mistakes and there's some things that we don't know, that doesn't mean that it's God's fault that we believe those false things. In fact, the idea that God does not exist is what determines that we have false beliefs. The fact that God created us with the capacity for knowledge doesn't.
Now you're begging the question.
Doesn't mean that he is causing us to have false beliefs. So that's where the disconnect is. If God exists and he created us to have knowledge, then if we make mistakes and we have false beliefs, then it's because we made the mistake. It's not, and God created us with the ability to reason properly, but we have to discipline ourselves to do that. And if we don't, then that doesn't mean that it's God's fault if he exists. But if God doesn't exist, then it's natural law that is determining everything that we believe, including our false beliefs, and therefore that destroys knowledge. The idea that God does exist makes knowledge possible. The idea that he doesn't exist makes knowledge impossible.
I disagree. Because if there is a God that created us and created us capable of knowing false things, one of those false things could be the existence of the God. Or one of those false things could be that God is a good God. Maybe that God created us to believe false things because it's a trickster God. And so I don't think that line of reasoning gets you to a good God that wants you to know truth.
But that's only true if God determines our beliefs, if he exists.
No.
It's not a foregone conclusion that if God exists and created us with the capacity for knowledge, that he determines our false beliefs.
No.
Okay.
If there's a God if there's a trickster God out there that created us to believe false things because he wanted to sit there and be entertained by whatever it was that we came up with that we thought of, he wouldn't be determining what we think. He's just being entertained by what we think.
Hey, Kelly, are you saying, make sure I'm understanding you correctly on that. So if even today as Godless Granny, if you did have sufficient proof that Christianity was true, you would be willing to worship Jesus?
No. And the reason is because the God of the Bible is an immoral God. The God of the Bible is good with genocide. He's good with slavery. He says that women are property. And I would not worship a God that has such a low view of humanity.
See, that I think is part of the issue that we're talking about right now, the difference between merely assenting to the fact that a God exists. And sometimes we as Christians like, well, that's a stepping stone toward the kind of faith we're talking about. You got to believe God exists, then you've got to believe in that God. He has to exist first. That's his first stepping stone. But really, I think that's what's kind of missing from this conversation. God's not that interested in making sure you believe he exists if you're not going to worship him anyway. So I think that might be part of the hiddenness problem that we're talking about.
Okay, except I did.
See, I asked Matt Dillahunty this question a couple of years ago. We had a 10-minute conversation after a debate that he had, and he said, if Jesus rose from the dead, I would have expected to see more kind of evidence of it. And so I asked him to list out. I know he wasn't talking about video evidence, but so what kind of evidence? And he thought about it for a minute. He said, well, actually, there's no possible way of having that evidence. And then I said, well, if you did have the evidence, though, you're saying that you would worship him. And he said the exact same thing you did. He said, I would agree that he existed reluctantly, but there's no way I'm worshiping that God. And so he had that same response. And so that the kind of questions as you're expecting God to do, if God is all powerful and all knowing, then he would know how to prove to me that he exists. I think he's capable of doing that, but there's no point in it because you're not going to have the kind of faith we're talking about in that God.
Except I did. I did worship this
that.
God for 42 years. And if there really was an all-loving God that cared about me and cared about a relationship with me, he would have let me die before he would have let me do that. I mean, if one of my children was going to be tortured for eternity unless I did something, I wouldn't just sit there and watch it and do nothing. Which is
I know
exactly
you don't want to make the argument that you've lived
deconverted.
too long. I know I don't think that's the argument you're wanting to make here.
What do you mean?
You're saying if Christianity is true, then you lived too long?
Yeah.
Really?
Doesn't one of the epistles talk about people dying because they were going to be falling away and God kind of cut them short?
In a judgment sense, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Well,
there's biblical warrant for that.
There's certainly plenty of other things. I asked my pastor over and, talked about my doubts, and my pastor had no answers for me. If there was a loving God that was able to reveal himself to me, he should have given these answers to her and let her explain them to me. She could have recommended some books that had answers for me, but nobody had any answers for me.
I remember praying to God when I was still praying, saying, "Hey, God, if you're real and Jesus is your son, strike me dead. Give me about 5 seconds to repent and believe. Give me a heart attack, but give me 5 seconds so I can, and do it right, today, so I'll know this is a sign, and I'll repent, or strike me blind, something like that. You do something, honor my request. So, the disciples were saying, help us, I believe, but help my, or what is it that they said exactly?
Help me in my unbelief.
Help me in my unbelief.
Yes,
So
yeah.
I prayed that more times than y'all can count. So I was earnest.
Problem is, though, we just heard from somebody who says that they wouldn't believe even if things like that happened. And and Jesus was right when he said that people aren't going to believe even if they see somebody rise from the dead. So if someone has made up their mind that they're not going to believe, then none of those things are going to convince them.
I agree with you, Phil. I just want to make that distinction, though. Believe in the existence versus having the kind of faith where you would be willing to worship. So I think by using that word believe, we're using it too generically without specifying what we mean by that.
By the way, James, Matt Dillahunty just had an interview on Capturing Christianity. debate, and he said pretty much the same thing he said when he talked to you, that it would have to be pretty darn strong. I mean, video evidence. He's a magician, by the way, so he's used to being fooled. By the way, here's the problem. We have scientific evidence, but when we're dealing with historiography, when we're dealing with specifically the New Testament, we use other rules. Obviously, we can't have Jesus walk on the water again and again and test it like we do a chemistry test. So what we use is criteria like embarrassment, like the women discovering Jesus. That's an embarrassing thing, and it lends credibility to the truthfulness. The problem is, I just heard an interview with Dale Allison. He said all these criteria, embarrassment, coherence, dissimilarity, does this sound too much like a Christian said it? All these are coming into question, and he's questioning all these criteria, even multiple attestation, where you have Paul, Mark, and Luke claiming Jesus rose again. It could be they all met each other. It could be we could be down to a single witness. So, and Peter, I'm sorry, Mark, Peter, and Paul, he goes, that since they hung around each other, that could be boiled down to like Peter telling Paul and Luke these things. So the criteria we have to judge the truthfulness of New Testament is very, very problematic.
Well, I can't believe our time is already up. And so, Kelly, I want to say thank you so much for being our guest. If for those of you who have not had time, please go back to our Facebook page or go to atheistchristianbookclub.com. And one of those two places, watch the interview that Daniel Ray did with Kelly. And I think you're going to get a much better understanding than of the background of that whole journey from Christianity to atheism. Fascinating. I'm looking forward to hearing Ken on your program on Godless Granny YouTube channel. Brady, I'll even try
by how many of us here are going to be interviewed by her. I mean, almost all of us here, right?
Yeah, this is like a preview to upcoming Godless Granny.
That's how you know you're really in the club.
And Phil is almost going to he's almost booked for an interview too. So we will enjoy that. Thank you so much, you guys, for hanging in here, being part of our club, and we will see you next month.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, very, very much. I appreciate your grace and your poise in all of this. It was very commendable. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you for having me.